You'll notice that something popped up that we are recording. A number of people asked us if we would be recording this to show later. A lot of people had conflicts. No surprise, it is during the workday. I am going to mute everyone. That way we don't hear any background noise or barking dogs or crying babies or whatever it may be. And we can really focus on our three presenters. My name is Evan Rutter. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Parent Engagement at Claremont McKenna. Also an alumnus of the college, and it's an absolute thrill to have three of our most recent graduates from the class of 2020 here to share their research projects. For those of you that are not aware, CMC has a senior thesis requirement, which is a capstone project. It is supposed to be based on the student's major, and there are some variations within that, of course. But many alumni remember their thesis and working with their thesis reader, a faculty member at the college, very fondly. We're very excited to have Laleh, Max, and Annette here to share their projects and to share their research. So we're going to do about 10 minutes per presentation. We're going to go with Laleh, and then Max and Annette, and then we'll do all questions at the end for about 20-25 minutes. If you open up the chat feature, where everyone's putting their name and their class year, if you have a question and you maybe don't want to forget it, go ahead and put it in that chat. I will copy it and paste it into the appropriate alumnus or alumnus area and ask that question later on. And of course, later on, you can virtually raise your hand to ask a question directly. So on the top right, there's both speaker view and grid view. I recommend speaker view so you can see who is speaking. Grid view if you want to see all the different names. Some of our recent graduates will be sharing their screen to show their research. So don't be surprised when your screen goes away and a PowerPoint pops up. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Laleh Ahmed, who's also a member of the Alumni Association Board of Directors and the senior class president for the class of 2020. Laleh, who's currently in Washington, D.C. The topic of her presentation is Killing Within Communities, What Causes Collective Violence, How We Remember It, and Why It Matters. Laleh will explore motivations for violence beyond traditional explanations of ethnic hatred or racism. Laleh, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Evan. Hi, everyone. As Evan said, I'm an alum from the class of 20, and this was my senior thesis, which I haven't talked about in a little while, actually. My screen is loading. Oh, there we go. So yeah, as Evan said, Killing Within Communities, basically the main idea behind my thesis is kind of collective violence. And so what I wanted to explore was why people would kill members of their own community. And so it's cases of people who have lived together for a long time rising up against their neighbors, or people who used to be their friends, or in certain cases, family. And my question was kind of trying to go beyond just like state-sponsored violence, where the state kind of has their own forces perpetuating violence, and more when they kind of, through propaganda and like various other methods, convince civilians to commit violence against other civilians. And so I kind of described that in the introduction. I define collective violence really specifically, so to be able to have a framework to explore it in my thesis. The way in which I describe it is either a group acting, committing violence on another group, or an individual on behalf of a collective, and that might be demographic, identity-based, or ideological, committing violence on a group. And I use two frameworks to kind of explore the why question. And the first one is power threat theory, which kind of talks about how when a minority group seems to be gaining power against a majority group, the majority group often lashes out. And in this, the power is really important because what it is relative, not absolute. Because minority groups very rarely actually gain absolute power over the majority, but it's just the perception. The second one is political elite theory, and it talks about how political elites often manufacture violence for ego or political purposes. Typically, violence is not the end in itself. It tends to be winning an election or a larger national goal. And the second kind of question is I talk about historical myths and legacy formation. And what I'm exploring is how we remember cases of violence and how those legacies and the way in which we memorialize them might contribute to current cases of violence. And I have 4 case studies that I'm about to go through. So the first one is the Tulsa Race Massacre, which has been talked about a lot recently because it came up in the show The Watchmen, which kind of brought it back into our like collective memory, although its legacy had been pretty silenced before that in scholarship. And what I talk a lot about is the idea of the American dream and how in the US only specific communities are able to access the American dream. And that's shown really clearly through the case of Tulsa, because when the relatively wealthy Black community of Tulsa began to kind of amass political and economic power, which was known as Black Wall Street, the white majority kind of lashed out and effectively raised their community in a way that meant that they were never able to build up that wealth again. And I talk a lot about that, and I talk about how we remember it and how scholarship of it was largely suppressed because it was controversial, and my current relevance case study is then reparations in the US and the question of how maybe if we memorialized and talked about certain cases of violence and racism more accurately, the conversation around reparations and racism would really shift. My second case study is anti-Jewish pogroms, which largely happened in Poland and Ukraine around 1941 in the Second World War. What was interesting here is I was trying to specifically talk about pogroms as opposed to Holocaust in large, because the Holocaust was obviously state-sponsored violence. And what I wanted to explore is why non-Jewish people would kill Jewish people in moments that the Nazis did not force them to. In a lot of these towns, the Nazis were present, but did not actually take part in the violence or even incentivize violence. And so that was really interesting for me. And I talk a lot about how in towns where Jewish people showed more political support for parties that would grant them national rights and more minority rights, violence was more likely to break out. And so I talk about, again, the power threat theory and how Jewish people in towns where they were gaining relative political power often had massacres against them. And I talk a lot about how we kind of remember the Holocaust and community violence from the angle of like theological discrimination and myths of like Jewish culpability and like general anti-Semitic tropes and how those were a motivator for violence. And I basically talk about how those are very foundational features of course, if anti-Semitism didn't exist, then things like the Holocaust and anti-Jewish pogroms wouldn't exist. But anti-Semitism was obviously very prevalent in Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, but not every Eastern European town had a pogrom. And so what set pogroms apart from just other towns? And then I talk about memorialization currently in Poland and Germany. And I basically compare how in Germany, there's a lot of talk about the Holocaust and reparations and anti-Semitism. And they've memorialized it via museums and street art and street memorials. And you can kind of tell that collectively in Germany, there's more of a memory of what happened and the violence committed against Jews. And it shows up in their politics. Whereas in Poland, there are typically far-right parties in power, and there aren't really enough museums or memorials. And if you were to, for example, walk through the streets of Polish cities, you would almost not be able to tell that there were Jewish ghettos there, and these were the sites of mass violence against Jews. My third case study is the India-Pakistan partition. And in this one, I stray a little bit from power threat theory and talk about political elite theory, and basically talk about how the founders of India and Pakistan, and then Gandhi, often used a lot of nationalist rhetoric that nationalized and racialized a religious difference. And so kind of created a lot of polarization that eventually led to violence. And they did so that they were able to achieve largely anti-imperialist and nationalist gains, and thought that violence was kind of necessary collateral in the process. And they needed to like kind of incite anger against the British government. But while they did that, they also, for example, created a lot of anger against the Muslim minority or the Hindu majority. And then I talk about how that has really led to a lot of conflicts surrounding Kashmir, because the way in which we remember the partition in each country has really villainized the other country, which has led to, of course, like decades and decades of hate and distrust. My last case study is violence as a result of colonial rule, and I talk about the Rwandan genocide. And I basically talk about how Belgian rule was able to kind of pit one group, the Hutus, against the Tutsis, and it would often grant one group power over another. And so it created a lot of deep-seated polarization and distrust of the other group. And so there was this constant, over the course of 150 years, like victim-perpetrator cycle, where one group would gain power over the other one and then commit violence, and then the other group would gain power and then commit violence back. And this case study, I talked a lot about reconciliation, because Rwanda as a country actually focused a lot very intentionally on how to reconcile those two groups to break that legacy of the victim-perpetrator cycle. And so as opposed to just like locking up the Hutu majority en masse for the violence they committed, a lot of it has been like very local and community-based courts to kind of facilitate a process of healing that might create longer-term healing rather than just a kind of punitive response by locking them up. In my conclusion, I tie all the general themes I've talked about back to US mass shootings, and it's kind of like my so what chapter, trying to explain how like all these historical ideas and events really matter currently. And I basically talk about how all of them apply to US mass shootings in some ways or the other. And then I talk about how our current media narrative surrounding mass shootings is contributing to creating a really problematic legacy around them, and really creating an environment in which we will not find a lot of change. Yeah. So that's my thesis finding at large. I think it has some limitations because it could not be longer than it was. And if I were to explore the topic in the future, which I kind of think I will do, I would talk a lot more about gender-based violence and kind of explore theory around that. I would talk a lot more about theological justifications for violence, because I think that's really important. I would explore local cases in a lot more depth and kind of have a narrower approach. Basically, my by and large point of my thesis was that ethnic hatred and racism contributes a lot to violence, but they tend to be foundational reasons rather than the catalyst that actually sparks violence.
Thank you, Laleh. If anyone has a question for Laleh, go ahead and put it into the chat. We're going to do Q&A at the end. So if you are worried you might forget, go ahead and enter it there. Next up, we have Max Knowles, who is currently in Berkeley, California, but from Southern California. Max's topic is populism, an exploration into the American case through academic literature, data analysis, and fiction. Max will discuss the rise of populism within the US. Max, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all for being here. This is really fun. So I think it's only appropriate just to quickly acknowledge and thank my readers, Professors Georgie Arashutza of the Government Department and Leland de la Durante of the Literature Department, and as well as my parents, who I believe are in attendance, who homeschooled me through high school and continue to be supportive of my crazy creative ideas here. So my thesis is basically three different stories, three parts, three stories of what populism is. And the first one is a literature review, which is just this condensation of the main books and articles that have been written on the topic. And I'm going to just roll through this pretty quickly, roll through part two pretty quickly, and then spend a little more time on part three, because I think it might be a little more interesting for our purposes here, and also just my favorite part of the three. So chapter one of part one is just going through some definitions, establishing what populism is, as it's kind of a big buzzword in American politics right now. So as a start, populists are moralistic, meaning they have a very strong belief that they possess an idea of what the good is. They have the concept of the good. And coupled with that, they're anti-pluralistic, meaning that whereas ideally in a liberal democracy, we think that everyone has an equal opportunity or an equal voice at the political deliberative table, populists don't necessarily believe this is or ought to be the case. And you hear this with Trump's rhetoric about what the real American is, and that the real American is the one whose voice matters. And then thirdly, populists are anti-elitists. On the populist right, we see this more being driven by a resentment of the career politician. And that's how someone like Trump, who is wildly wealthy, can still be considered anti-elitist because he's the non-politician, the outsider. And then on the populist left, led by Bernie Sanders, would be probably the best example. It's more driven by a resentment of the wealthy elite, the people that seem to have won out in this unfair capitalist system, and then can leverage that wealth as power over society, or certainly over politics, perhaps. And then populists across the board seek self-actualization within a community. They have their idea of what a good community is, whether that's based on certain religious characteristics, ethnic groups, or it's a vision for a community that's more egalitarian or uses certain language that honors certain identities. The populist believes that community needs to have a certain fashion in order for them to flourish with their livelihood, their identity, etc. So then chapter 2, I dive further into this story and basically try to build out a case that both left-wing and right-wing populism have a shared heritage in the techno-economic paradigmatic shift that took place in the early 1970s with the rise of the microprocessor and the globalization and cultural change that accompanied that shift. And what happened is we moved from a manufacturing to an information-driven economy. And what that did is that combined with automation depletes many jobs in the middle of the job distribution. You have a chunk of jobs that shift that are of lower income towards services, and then a few jobs that sneak into this high cognitive tasks. They require high education to succeed in the information sector, whether it's banking, consulting, tech, etc. Now, the reaction to this on the left has been, well, this has created this huge and widening economic inequality. And that's an issue because it can deplete the opportunity for those at the lower end of the distribution, but it also allows all this wealth that's being concentrated at the top to manifest itself as political power with private money in politics, which is a liability in American politics especially. And then for the right-wing populism, for that form, it's more a reaction to an evolving way of life. And you see Trump appealing to the coal miners who have lost their jobs that used to be so reliable and that sat in the middle of this job distribution. So as those jobs die, those jobs go abroad or they're automated. We see a fundamental transformation of a way of life, and the right-wing populists wants to go back to an old and better way of life. And then chapter 3, I just quickly run through the rise of social media and our increased consumption of news online, and how that can lead to a proliferation of fake news and polarization and echo chambers, and how these are nonpartisan causes of populism in the United States. So then part 2 is my second story. And this is a story built around data and me attempting to see if the humanities and social sciences with their literature might actually be close empirically if we were to take a quick look at this from a data science perspective. And long story short, I basically landed on 3 key variables, and I looked at over 20 dimensions of political and economic life. So social class equality and civil liberty, and civil society organization participatory environment, those are 2 index scores, are positively correlated with populism. But the unemployment rate, which I think this is counterintuitive, an increase in unemployment is actually negatively correlated with a rise in populism. So what does this leave us with? Well, it left us with a model where if you get the information for these 3 variables at right now, this model can predict with 80% accuracy whether or not there will be a populist president or candidate 2 years from now. And I tried to set this up so perhaps you as a citizen or someone in business or in politics might be able to act on the information today before we end up with a tough situation 2 years from now. And indeed, if you use 2018 data, this model does predict a populist president or presidential candidate in 2020. So the third story in my thesis about populism is literally a story. And this was an original work of fiction that I wrote, attempting to allegorize the rise of populism. And it starts with a foreword by McKenna, who is a professor of political science who lives in the next century. And she's writing this foreword to a work of fiction written by a Claremont McKenna senior named Oliver Wolf. And it's a set of 6 cantos. And then attached to Oliver's work are 2 fictional commentaries. One is by a conservative professor of government named Andrew Aristeas, and the second by a left-wing political commentator, Simon Gauthier. So some key elements of this story. In this allegory, the story takes place in the brain of a woman named Demos, or the people, whose consciousness has been disrupted. And the narrative is effectively the interplay between the savior of tradition, our conservative voice, who actually represents the dreams of the left hemisphere of the brain, versus the savior of justice, or our liberal leader, who represents the dreams of the right hemisphere of the brain. And the whole story is a battle of which unconscious ideas will rise in the mind of Demos and reestablish as et collectivum conscientia, the collective consciousness, or what ideally the government or the state should be, but that's clearly not the case today. So to finish my contribution here, I just like to read Canto 6 from this work, The Mind of Demos, because I think it ties some of this together and it drops us off where I think we approximately are as an American society today. So, Canto 6, when Demos awoke, the consciousness of the mind, et collectivum conscientia, had been claimed by the savior of tradition. The left had commanded language to manipulate the mind, fooling itself into conceding consciousness to the promises of protection, the rhetoric of the real. Despite this new conscious belief, Demos is still sick and new dreams remain in the unconscious. Information continued to flow, favoring the once forgotten dreams of the left, who felt their voice return. The savior of tradition claims the plague is past, but the mind of Demos has yet to find its past union of the left and right. The book of the Mind of Demos can attest to this division. The fall of voices weakened the faith of dreams in their place, marshalling mania in the medium of the book. This atrophy of the articulate rewarded a tragedy of tradition, one that will only triumph again upon future reflections, unless dutiful dreams of mutual doubt and humble hope slide into the psychology of the left, celebrating those sentiments born of reason and bearing words of patient bravery where wisdom is absent. Their voices feel empty, but there is power in listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. If anyone has a question for Max and they're worried about forgetting in a few minutes, go ahead and put that into the chat now, and I will copy it over to our document for the Q&A portion. Next up, all the way from Hong Kong, Annette, I think it's very early in the morning there, so thank you for staying up or getting up early, depending on how you like to live your life. Thank you so much for doing this as well.
Yeah, no worries.
Thank you, Annette. Annette's topic is Desperate for Democracy, a comparison between Hong Kong's umbrella movement and the 2019 AntiELAB protests. Annette will discuss 2 major anti-government protests that brought the city to a standstill. Annette, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annette. I'm zooming in from Hong Kong today, where I grew up and it's my home, and which is also what the topic is about. I wrote my thesis for the International Relations Department with my thesis advisor being Professor Min-Shin Pei. He really helped me a lot in this thesis. It was really great. If I'm looking down, I'm just looking at my notes as I do this presentation, but so I wrote about the Hong Kong protests. So if you guys know, in 2014, Hong Kong had a huge protest called the Umbrella Movement. It essentially protested the bill that was pushing back on democratic voting. So essentially they infringe upon universal suffrage. And then in 2019, there was another round of protests, but these were a lot more violent and a lot more long-lasting. And these were against the anti-extradition law and bill, which is what AntiELAB stands for. And so I really wanted to see why they deferred so much. So there are two main parts of my thesis. The first part goes through the historical reasons. So looking at the handover from the UK to China and the creation of Hong Kong as a special administrative region. And the second part looks at the two protests and compares them specifically. So first of all, looking at the historical perspective, let me move this. You can see, we see that one of the main reasons is that the negotiations to create Hong Kong's basic law, which is essentially our constitution, was a two-leg stool. Actually, the Chinese government actually said this, that it was the decisions to be made were only two parties to be needed to make this decision, which were China and the UK. Number two, the laws that were passed, both the joint declaration, which led into the basic law, were vague and rushed. And there was a lot of room for flexibility in the law. So if I went back and looked at the legislation, and if you look at it, it's very vague. So essentially China, whatever they wanted to say, that would be something related to, this infringes upon the law or this infringes upon the law. It could be applied to because it was just so vague. Thirdly, it was very rushed. It was done in a very, very short amount of time, which also meant a lot of issues weren't really thought about and were left unresolved. For example, rules that have amendments, like how do you make amendments to this law? And regarding relationships between the UK and China, as time went on, potential internal shocks like economic crises or political crises, those really weren't considered when putting into law, which was bound to create disaster as time came to be. And then I briefly outlined the recent history of Hong Kong since the past, like the handover. But I'm not going to go into that today, just so I can focus more on the two comparisons, the comparison of the two protests. So if we look at one of the first comparisons that I make, there are 5 in total. This is the first one. It's the trigger of the protests. So the 2014 protests were triggered by a retraction of a policy that was never fully enacted in the first place. So universal suffrage in Hong Kong had never been experienced. So as Hong Kong citizens, when we vote for our district, and their district votes for the president of Hong Kong, which we call a chief executive. And that was not really ever there. And so Hong Kong citizens had been promised that by 2014, they would be on the way to getting universal suffrage. But when 2014 came by, the government said, actually, we don't want universal suffrage anymore. So people were mad, but it wasn't as urgent as when 2019 rolled around, because they didn't feel like the status quo was changing necessarily. People definitely took the streets, but it was much more peaceful, and it was kind of more like getting something that they were promised. On the other hand, in 2019, it was triggered by an infringement directly upon the democratic rights of Hong Kong citizens. The extradition bill, which would force suspected Hong Kong citizens to be tried under Beijing's legal system, literally blurs the line between Hong Kong and Beijing's rule of law. And this was seen as an imminent threat to Hong Kong's sovereign political securities. And you can see those in these two pictures, where in the first one, it's people are mad, but they're not as desperate. And on the second ones, where people are getting more desperate and had to resort to violence to show how desperate they were. The second main difference was the political circumstances of Hong Kong between 2014 and 2019. So here I looked at what changed leading up to 2019. One of the main things was the growth of Chinese sharp power in Hong Kong. And so sharp power is defined as the intimidation, coercion, censorship, and manipulation in order to diminish the validity of a victim's nation's institutions. So for example, leading up to 2019, there were like a lot of book publishers in Hong Kong who were like kidnapped, presumably, because they just disappeared and then suddenly showed up in mainland China with confession tape. So that was really sketchy and people were incredibly scared. There was also the barring of people's ability to criticize the Chinese national anthem, so any mockery of it. And during football games, people were booing the national anthem and that was made illegal. And then also an increase of the national education system, so a China-backed educational system in Hong Kong. So this increased a lot of anxieties between 2014 and 2019, which ultimately led to the 2019 protests being just so much more explosive and violent and long-lasting. Another main reason I looked at in this section was the difference in leadership. So during the 2014 protests, CY Leung was the leader and he had very close relationships with Beijing, and Beijing helped him a lot to enforce a conservative trajectory of the protests and also trusted CY Leung to carry out what he needed to do. Versus in 2019, Carrie Lam, this woman who's on the screen right now. Carrie Lam was a lot less trusted in the Hong Kong political scene. She was seen as pretty new, and so she knew this, and she was perhaps more vulnerable and afraid that Beijing would be judging her. So she was more inclined to take extreme actions in combating protesters, essentially letting out police force much more easily and letting out violence by police much more easily. And this just exacerbated the feelings of anger and the tensions between Hong Kong citizens and the government. So this was another main reason. The third key difference that I looked at was the socioeconomic environment. So Hong Kong already has some of the world's most outlandish housing prices out there, and translated to levels of high socioeconomic inequality. As you can see on this graph, it measures the price of housing in Hong Kong. It has only increased over the years. And between 2014 and 2019, the expectation and the promise by the government was to make these housing prices go down to ensure more public housing. However, they didn't do that. So this created a lot of distrust and sadness, especially in younger generations of Hong Kong citizens who just became frustrated at the government. And they took these to the streets, these frustrations. Not only were they already frustrated about the lack of democracy and infringement upon fundamental human rights in Hong Kong, but they were all, had low-paying jobs and incredibly unhappy, and took all this anger to explode it onto the streets as well, creating a more kind of explosive protest environment. And the fourth key difference was I looked at the protest strategies between the 2014 and 2019 protests. This is really interesting. So I got a lot of my information. I'm talking to someone who came to the AF. He worked as a journalist in Hong Kong covering the protests, and I got to talk to him, and that was really cool. But essentially, in 2014, the protest strategies was Occupy Central, if you guys heard that during the protest. So protesters would sit in the main financial area of Hong Kong, essentially barring traffic from going through, barring people from going to work, but they would stay in one place. And this would mean they would be easily swept up by police officers and taken away. So the movement, the umbrella movement, just dispersed so much more quickly. Another thing is that there was a difference in protest leadership. In 2014, this man on the screen, Joshua Wong, he was one of the key student leaders, and having a key leader in political movements is just a better recipe for a more conductive, a more straightforward, a more peaceful movement. And so we saw in 2019 that both of these didn't happen. So protesters learned from their mistakes in 2014, and instead of being swept up by the police, they adopted this phrase by Bruce Lee, who's a Hong Kong actor and also a Kung Fu artist. The phrase was be water. So like water, the protesters would constantly move around, they would escape the police, they would have peaceful marches that quickly shifted in different directions, so they would avoid police capture and making the movement last much longer. And additionally, there was no key leader in the 2019 protests, which meant that without a key leader, there wasn't anyone to keep protesters, accountable towards a certain goal. And so a lot of them just took off on their own route, making it much more chaotic. And lastly, I looked at media and technology. So during my first semester of senior year, I'm a dual media studies major. So I did my media studies thesis on these protests, specifically looking at a media and technology lens. And I made a graphic, essentially a graphic interactive magazine. So you can't interact with this, but in the main version, you can interact with these elements of the magazine. But I took that and put that in my final IR thesis. So what I came to is for broadcast media, so SCMP in 2014, Hong Kong's main English media outlet, was engaging in neutral reporting. They sided with protesters, and protesters felt like domestically in Hong Kong, they had backing from the press, and they felt more at ease and were more likely to, not engage in as outlandish actions. Whereas in 2019, SCMP was bought by Alibaba, which is a huge Chinese company with ties to the Chinese Communist Party. So this created a loss of local reporting accountability, which spurred anxiety amongst protesters. Another thing was looking at social media. So in 2014, yes, Hong Kong citizens did use social media, but not to the extent that it was used in 2019. I pulled from media theory, looking at how, media sites like Facebook and Instagram and how those algorithms work. They encourage engagement in politics that often focus only on one side, not the overall picture. Similar to what Max talked about populism, it encourages more extreme sides. And finally, I also looked at technology and apps. So Hong Kong citizens leading up to 2019, preparing for the time that went by, engaged in a lot of creating a lot of apps. And there was one specific app, Telegram, which allowed Hong Kong citizens to communicate with each other on an encrypted site and via Bluetooth to avoid their information leaked to the Chinese government and the Hong Kong police force. So yeah, conclusion. As you guys know, this year, Hong Kong just had a national security law, which essentially bypassed all of the previous protests and everything, made protesting illegal, made saying certain things illegal, essentially a huge infringement on rights that include the extradition bill. So in my thesis conclusion, this hadn't happened yet, but it suddenly just became so much more, relevant. But I talked about that the only way the city can confront its political insecurities is by promoting a democratic rule of law, safeguarding citizens' individual rights, and alleviating economic inequality. If the government is unable to prevent this, the next large wave of protests and international backlash is going to happen, which we currently see is happening. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. If you have any questions for Annette, go ahead and put it in the chat. The first question I have is actually one that Lauren Steck submitted for all of you. If you would all answer, and we'll go in order of Laleh and then Max and then Annette. Let Annette have a little breather. What do you plan to do next, or currently are doing now? And how has this work prepared you for your plans, if at all? Laleh?
So next or currently, I'm in DC and I'm working for The Sentry, which is a human rights nonprofit. I'm an investigative fellow under the ELBA's fellowship through the McGrublian Center. Well, for one, doing a huge research project in general, I think really helps in an investigative research role. But I think more specifically, it's in the same realm of things that I'm interested in. A lot of what I was kind of trying to explore in my thesis was why violence happens. And in this role right now, we're doing a similar thing, except we're exploring how violence is profitable and how political elites often engineer violence because they're able to line their own pockets.
Well, could you add a little bit about your connection to the McGrublian Center and what the kind of work you did while you were in school with the McGrublian Center and how it relates to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I've worked for the McGrublian Center since I was a sophomore. Sophomore year, I was a student assistant, so I kind of aided the McGrublian Center with their own projects, and I helped Professor Populism with research. Junior year, I was a legal research assistant, and so the McGrublian Center paired a bunch of us with a lawyer from LA who did human rights research, and I helped with that the entire year. This year, I was a research fellow, so I actually paired with the McGrublian Center and Professor Ferguson to be able to write my thesis, and then applied in around February for the ELBA's fellowship, which is a one-year fellowship in which the McGrublian Center gives us a grant to be able to pursue work with a nonprofit. And myself and my peer Jenny Gurav got the fellowship, and both of us are actually working in DC, although I believe she's moving much later than I am. And so I've also done sponsored internships with the McGrublian Center over the last 2 years, and last summer I worked at the Sentry, which is where I am now with the McGrublian Center. So a pretty direct connection from McGrublian.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laleh. Max, same question for you.
Sure, yeah. So currently I'm a few days off of my 2-month anniversary at a company called Zero Grocery, and I'm a product operations manager at the company. It's a seed stage, zero waste grocery delivery startup in the Bay Area. And then I'm also helping to launch a creative community that should go live in late August to early September. As for how this translated, I don't think it's direct, but I do think there's value in being able to try to deal with numbers and also think creatively and to not feel too tied to a paradigm. And it has allowed me to contextualize what I'm doing, I think. We're an ethically driven company. We're trying to make a profit, but we're trying to do it in the right way, I think. And I came to the company during COVID, and 2 weeks in, the protests started, many of which were in this area. And I think it was important to understand where we, not only the work we were doing as a company in a market, but also where we sat as people in the country. And as the 7th or 8th employee, I was a part of this intimate team that was good about discussing that. And you know, I guess going through something like this made me comfortable switching between, you know, I work directly as someone that works in product between a data scientist who's working through K-means clustering to help us with a delivery algorithm. And I understand just enough of that to be able to contextualize those outputs. But I also understand how, you know, how to communicate with people and deal with drivers and how bags need to just fly onto vans on any given day. And that's just how delivery works. So I think that the thesis probably helped my skill set more than it has translated, I guess, on an intellectual level.
Well, and thank you for helping all those incredible deliveries that are so needed right now for so many people. Annette?
Yeah, so I'm currently working for a nonprofit startup in New York, but I'm working from Hong Kong, and doing marketing strategy and brand partnerships. Most of my internship experience and what I'm interested in is in marketing. International relations just has like an overview of international political economy, and I'm generally interested in it. But I'm also, so this is just like widened my experience, but definitely CMC's Impact Fellowship has helped me a lot in terms of finding something to do right now. But next year I'll be going to grad school in the UK for management and business side things. But this topic is just super interesting to me as someone from Hong Kong and who loves my city. But yeah.
Annette, where are you going to school in the UK?
I'm going to King's College London, if you guys know. So.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Annette and Max as well, anything specific you did on campus, you might as well share that. I know Laleh as well. I know Laleh was an Athenaeum Fellow, which I think is the envy of many of us. But any other comments about your CMC experience, kind of what you did before we move on to some other questions? Max, go ahead.
Trying to, as far as tie-in, I'm not sure if there's a direct tie-in beyond the fact that I was a PPE major, and I think coming to that degree from a very like conservative homeschool background and then kind of entering this whole world of different ideas and everything probably made the project a very good fit. But generally speaking, you know, I was also the team captain of the track team. I was involved in numerous clubs, some of which were more entrepreneurial, and also had a couple stints in student government here and there. So I was all over the place, I guess.
Excellent. All right, anything else, Annette or Laleh, you wanted to add before we go on to some questions?
Nothing that really necessarily ties into international relations, but I was the president of the International Student Association the last 2 years. I worked at the public affairs office. So a lot of people here I've worked with as well. And I also worked at the admissions office as a tour guide. So just stuff I did. Everybody at CMC kind of does a lot of things. So.
Great. Well, anything else before I move on? Good to go? Okay. So Laleh, you get the first question since you went first. Someone asked, when you mentioned that the social media coverage of these mass shootings contribute, What specific modes of engagement were you thinking about?
I think I am just kind of talking about the discourse around mass shooters. I think there are a lot of thematic ways in which our language is kind of problematic. I obviously think that like the racial element of like the lone shooter is really problematic. I also think that the media tends to kind of want to dissect each individual mass shooter and their background and their motivations. And I think there's like kind of a larger message to uncover here, in which most of these mass shooters seem to feel very kind of politically and culturally disenfranchised. And a lot of it stems from whiteness and masculinity. And I think there's a lot to be explored there as why these like kind of like young white men in America feel so disenfranchised and kind of at threat. Because most, even if you read through manifestos, which I totally would not recommend to anyone, most of their language is kind of around this idea that like white culture is at threat and like men are at threat as women kind of like gain control and as like immigrants like take over and as like white birth rates decrease. And so I think it's not so much a question of like, oh, this man was suicidal when he was a teenager, as it is of like all of these men seem to feel like their culture is at threat. I also really think that the kind of like cult personality the media builds up around mass shooters is very problematic, because most of the mass shooters very explicitly commit violence for fame because they're all trying to outdo the last one. And a lot of reformed white nationalists say a similar thing, in which they're all trying to kind of outdo Timothy McVeigh, who is the guy who like bombed the Oklahoma public building. And so putting their names out there and kind of giving them the fame that they want or wanted spurs more young men to kind of feel as though like, while they might feel that their life is useless, if they committed acts of violence, people would remember them.
Thank you. Next question goes to Max. Someone put a question that they were intrigued by the predictive modeling for a populist candidate and president in 2020, wondering if or how you might think or feel differently now.
I feel very differently now because I was using every variable you can imagine except COVID. So I think that throws things off quite a bit. That's a pretty strong exogenous stress. So although, I mean, I was right in that, yes, we have a candidate, but as for the future, I think if you were to put in the 2019 numbers, what does that mean for 2021? I don't know if it would be fair. I think that there's just too much that's different, and that's, you know, models work under certain assumptions, and those assumptions were true 6 months ago, but they're not right now, and that's okay.
Thanks. Annette, the last few months of protests in Hong Kong have been presented in some media as the Hong Kong people's last chance at democratic rights, expression, freedom of the press, etc. Before the end of one country, two systems in 2047. Would you agree with that, or might there still be possibilities?
Yeah, so in my thesis, I actually talked about how it is unlikely that Hong Kong will ever be independent, just the way how China functions and like how they see Hong Kong. But I do think that there's like, I mean, I'm an optimistic person, so I think like if at least some laws could be abided to, because I know there's a lot of international like backlash right now, both from the UK side, the US side, and China. Like I was listening to podcasts, and it's like China they don't want to just be a global superpower. They want to be a legitimate power. So at some point they have a line where they need to like seem legitimate in terms of their actions. So I want to be optimistic. But yeah.
Thank you. Laleh, Brian Davidson remembers an ath talk a few years ago by Jeffrey Capstone that seemed very much in line with your chapter on Jewish pogroms. Was he influential for you at all? Anything you disagreed with that he discussed?
Niche, but sure for someone who goes to the Athenaeum a lot. I will say that it was a very accurate question in that Jeffrey Capstone's doc is the reason I wrote the thesis that I wrote. It happened my junior fall, and I had this like very broad, vague, confusing idea for my thesis, and I was really trying to figure it out. And I had just spoken to a professor about it, and they had basically been like, that's too broad, you're never going to be able to do it. And directly after that, I went to the ath and sat at the head table for Jeffrey Capstone, and I talked to him about it, and he was like, oh, just wait for my talk, that's exactly what I'm doing. And so he gave his talk, and I bought his book after it, and we kind of emailed back and forth for a few months, and he recommended a lot of the other books that I used for my thesis. And so, yeah, big influence. He's in my thesis acknowledgements. Not only was his doc great, but he was more helpful than he had any obligation to be in terms of like emailing and giving me advice.
Quick follow-up to that, Laleh. Did you consult him during your thesis? Did you do anything besides maybe quote him and acknowledge him? Was he a part of the process at all?
I didn't consult him during my senior year when I was writing it, but in my junior spring, I emailed him a lot about kind of preliminary ideas and like a more like thematic questions of like how would be best to approach this, and got a lot of book recommendations from him. While I was writing it, I had like a lot of really helpful support from Professor Ferguson, and so didn't so much need that outside support. But we did reach out to him and email him, and we kind of spoke back and forth again after I finished writing my thesis and submitted it.
Great. The question for all three of you, and Max, we'll start with you. Your respective theses expose many of our worst traits. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the ability to affect positive change, and why? Why, Max?
Yeah, I was stalling. I haven't decided yet. I think when I was going through the project, I thought that this might have been a no return type of election. But one of the things that I couldn't figure out and that I was looking for throughout the whole research process was whether or not I believed that these things were highly cyclical, or whether or not this is a part of a larger entropy that liberal democracies just face. And maybe this is just where you end up at, because populism isn't just in the United States. We're maybe one of the biggest, hottest examples of late, but there are multiple liberal democracies throughout the world that are experiencing this. So I don't know. I'm an optimistic person, but you would need a concerted effort on the part of a couple tens of millions of people at minimum to change the way they communicate, most of all. And that doesn't necessarily mean the way they're voting, but the way they communicate is the start. And that's a big ask.
Annette, to you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the ability to affect positive change, and why?
Yeah, like I touched on before, I am an optimistic person, but within like a range of reality. So speaking about my topic, I think like I'm optimistic that Hong Kong people can have some, like, will try to make their way, but I'm not certain that it will go the way they completely want to, in terms of like being independent or getting all the rights that they want from China. But I do think in other platforms that like there is change to be made. I think China is just like a very interesting and special case. So yeah.
Thanks. Laleh?
Yeah, I mean, like Annette, I'm a pretty optimistic person in general. I mean, I think living through like the largest civil rights movement in history, I think lends a little bit to my hope and optimism. I also think that in my thesis and more generally, I tend to focus on more localized and community cases. And so like, while I don't think that me or anyone else maybe can prevent the next genocide, I do believe that certain policies and research and like community-based organizations can do a lot for groups. And I do think that like maybe it's not a question of like changing the world, but just changing one town or just like changing the lives of a few people, and that feels like a pretty noble cause within itself for one person. So
Great. Next question that came in is for Annette. Annette, obviously there's been a very large anti-racist movement centered around protests as a central praxis here in the US. In what manner do you see differences in the kind of protests viable in the US versus Hong Kong? Or even more specifically, how individual roles in protests could differ, i.e. white moms forming a line in front of protesters in Portland?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. There's some similarities, right? Like the idea that like violence or destruction of property, like what that means to different groups. So in the US, you have some groups that say like, why are you destroying property? It's nothing, there's no other way for us to get our point across. And then there's another group that says there is no other way, like there are other ways. And you see that in Hong Kong too. Like a lot of people are saying this is our last hope. We're not going to get attention unless we destroy everything. And there are other groups going, why are you destroying things? We want to live our lives. So I think that's really interesting. In terms of individuals, I think it's really different because whereas in the US, the idea is like the Black Lives Matter movement plays a lot on racial dynamics and like power in terms of race. In Hong Kong, it's very different because the power comes in the overarching like politics. So there's not really an individual that would be, for example, from mainland China who would come in and like stand for certain issues, because the line is pretty divided even within our own like pretty racially homogenous community. So in terms of individual action, I don't think so. But in terms of overall protest strategy and like the views on both of them and like the theories that go into it, I think there's a lot to be like drawn in terms of parallelity and power struggles. So yeah.
Great. Thank you, Annette, and thank you also, Max and Laleh, for your time today. Thanks everyone for joining us. As an employee of the college, as an alumnus of the college, I just think that that this work is absolutely spectacular. It reminds me of why I work at CMC, why I continue to support CMC, and very pleased that we are continuing to educate leaders across the different professions. So you three are all doing very different things. You get very different majors, and we look forward to your continued engagement. As you can see from this session and from others, we are here to support each other. So we're all one big community under the Claremont McKenna College umbrella. So I'm going to unmute everyone. So you can say hello, goodbye, thank you, and we hope to see you all next week at our programs. So you're all unmuted.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thanks for this
listening.
opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
You all.